Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 994 just came out, and this was another solid chapter from Onigashima. I enjoyed pretty much every scene from this chapter, and actually the very first scene was my favorite, even though it was pretty short, between Kaido and the Scabbards. So what's interesting is that we see that, Kaido is getting serious, and when he gets serious, he actually switches off of dragon form into his human form. We saw this back when he fought Luffy in Act 1, where at first he started off in dragon form, which is the more intimidating form. I remember everybody's reaction when we first saw that Kaido was a dragon. We were just like, how is Luffy ever possibly going to fight this? And then pretty shortly afterwards, we saw that, okay, it's not actually that hard for Luffy to knock around a large-sized dragon. It's when Kaido turns into his human form that he's basically getting serious. Now, we can all also assume that when Kaido gets, serious, that's when he's going to go into his hybrid form. Otherwise, having the Dragon Zone would kind of be pointless. It would just be for show, and I don't think Oda would ever do that. I think we can safely assume that his hybrid form is where he's at his max, but as we've seen so far, his human form for us so far, and the characters that we've seen, are basically when Kaido's starting to actually mean business. That makes sense based on what we've seen of past Zone users. For example, if we compare to Lucci, right? Lucci did briefly try to attack Luffy in just his leopard form, so in his straight up pure animal just leopard form, and that was not that effective. He got like a bite in or whatever, but we could obviously see that Lucci in his human form was a much more effective fighter than he was in his pure leopard form, and then Lucci in his hybrid form was obviously when he was at his best. So I think just a general trend for Zone users is going to be that their animal form is going to be their least competent. That's not what they're trained to fight in. That's just them in beast mode. Then their human form is probably going to be them at their standard level when they're, in their standard fighting mode. And then their hybrid form is when they're going all out, actually serious, right? So with Kaido, we have actually, you could take this chapter as saying, well, now he's getting serious, but in reality, he hasn't gotten serious until we see him break out the hybrid form. I assume he's going to do that against Luffy or Kid, or both of them whenever they make their way up to the top of Onigashima. Now, the reason I liked this first scene best was not just because Kaido turned back into human form, but because of the quote that we got from Kaido, which is that it was along the lines of basically, only in death does a man attain perfection. Something along those lines. And I really like that because it's giving us further insight into Kaido's character, and it's kind of reaffirming a lot of what we could have already speculated about him. So I talked about this in my Will Kaido Die video. And I personally don't believe that Kaido is going to die, largely because that is exactly what he wants. And it's not just to die, it's in the manner that he wants to die, which is from the past quotes that we've gotten from him, observing, Oden's death, reminiscing about Whitebeard's death. The past quotes that we've gotten from him seem to indicate that he believes that, as he said this chapter, death is the right death to cap off your life is the most important thing. So that's why Kaido wants a sort of epic grand death, because he really does believe that this is what cements you as a person. And we've seen throughout the history of One Piece that this really holds true, because Gold Roger's legacy probably became a lot bigger than it already was. I mean, of course, he was the king of the pirates, but it became so much stronger based on the fact that he died the way he did, basically sending like an entire generation of people out to the seas. So Roger will never be forgotten because of the way he died. Same with Whitebeard, not quite as grand as Roger going out, but everybody still remembers Whitebeard's death, and it's left a big impact on the pirates of today. And same with Oden, and what Oden's death did for the people of Wano. So this is just a consistent theme we've seen throughout the series. We've gotten, this messaging all the way back to Hirulook. The way that you die says so much about your character, and it sets the legacy that you leave behind for the characters in the future. And Kaido desperately wants that, even if he doesn't really have that sort of same noble aspect to why he wants to die the way he wants to die, the same way Roger did, the same way Whitebeard did, the same way Hirulook did, the same way Oden did, right? Kaido more so seems to want to die in an epic way because he has this surface level belief that if I get the right death, that is how I attain perfection as a man. So it's going to be interesting to see how this is explored further through this character, but I really like that he's now finally starting to express his philosophy and his personal beliefs. So I really like that. I hope we get to expand more on that. It was interesting to me that Kinemon said that despite the fact that Kinemon has been saying so far that they're all ready to die here, Kinemon clarified that dying to Kaido would bring them no honor, which is a little confusing to me because who did they expect to die to when they're coming to Onigashima, if not to Kaido, right? Like, all this time they've been saying, we're ready to die here, we're ready to die here. And Kinemon saying that, well, dying to you, though, would not be honorable. Maybe they expect that maybe they're just going to die a non-honorable death, but that doesn't seem quite right either. So maybe a little clarification is needed for that part. But anyway, I enjoyed that first scene. I hope we get more of Kaido, Kaido's thoughts, Kaido's perspective, his general philosophy and outlook. Beyond that, the rest of the chapter was a bit lighter. And I will say this real quick. I'll say I was wrong in that I had previously predicted that chapter 993, I expected the end of that chapter to have a very sort of table-turning moment or shift in momentum or something like that, where there would be a moment at the end of 993 that would then lead to a tone shift for the rest of the Onigashima raid, where things would start to go downhill. That didn't quite happen this chapter. We did, of course, see Kiku lose her arm at the end of 993. Also, side note, I like the utility use of Kinemon's fire ability to kind of not heal Kiku's arm, but basically burn the wound so that it stopped bleeding. But point being, basically, that's something that happened, but it didn't suddenly spiral into, the whole downward trend for the entire alliance afterwards, right? You could argue that it did based on the Ice Oni scene downstairs, but I feel like tonally it didn't shift things that much. So I'll say that I was wrong basically on 993. It did mark the first sort of major setback for the alliance, where it looks like, oh no, Kaido's actually going to defeat the Scabbards pretty cleanly, but it didn't actually suddenly change the momentum of the entire conflict as a whole. So I think that is still yet to happen. I'll just talk about, Onigashima raid, my predictions for that later on down the line, and what this chapter's tone kind of told me about how things are going to go. But moving on from that, before I talk about the Ice Onis, I just want to talk real quick about Luffy, Sanji, and Jinbei, that trio making their way up to the top of Onigashima. I'm liking this group's dynamic. I do wish that Oda would, pull back a little bit on the Sanji jokes, because we've seen him get the short end of the stick over and over, and he's been getting disrespected over and over. Hopefully he gets his big fight to basically make up for all of that, but at the same time I can't help but laugh at the Sanji jokes. So it's a bit of I feel bad for laughing, but it's just the way it is. What I'm really loving but also frustrated with at the same time, is all these gifters that are popping up. I like the gag that the gifters come in with some sort of absolutely absurd power, absolutely absurd body type, and are very, very, very confident in their abilities, and then basically immediately get one-shotted. And this has happened quite a few times so far. I'm enjoying the gag. It feels very classic One Piece-y, but at the same time, I can tell that it is basically filler, kind of taking up the time for Luffy to get to the top of Onigashima. You kind of just need to slip in some scenes showing okay, Luffy's slightly held up here, he's slightly held up here, it's just taking him a little bit to get up to the top. The way I put it is this: if I was watching the anime and I had no idea about what was actually canon in the manga, I would be assuming that a lot of these gifter scenes are filler, that they're just using to pad out time. But the reality is that they're canon, because Oda does need to canonically show in the manga, obviously, why it's taking Luffy a bit to get to the top, right? So that's always an issue. You gotta keep, Oda's even commented on this in interviews or SBSs or something at some point, that, he's always got to find ways to keep Luffy out of the picture, otherwise Luffy would just make it to the big bad too quickly. So in this case, it seems like a long line of gifters, basically, to slow him down in, quick comedic scenes. Now, the thing to remember, though, is that there is one character who is notable, who is actually making his way down from the top of Onigashima at the moment, at least last we saw him, and that's Jack. So the last we saw Jack, he had made his way to the top of Onigashima remarkably quickly compared to Luffy, although I guess he had no obstacles in his way. Jack had made it to the top of Onigashima, and Jack got a little messed up by the Dukes, so now he's actually making his way down. I have talked before in the past about how I believe that Luffy versus Jack is a fight that's set. I don't know if that's happening right now. I think that this could easily be maybe a quick confrontation. Maybe Sanji and Jinbei actually end up holding off Jack. Or maybe Jack is simply too, beaten up at the moment to actually even engage with these guys. But I do think we're going to get a quick confrontation, at least between Luffy and Jack. Not necessarily a fight, but at least they're going to be meeting up at some point as Luffy's on his way up and Jack's on his way down. Now, going down below, we have the Ice Oni scene, and I just realized basically this chapter because last chapter I thought it was a little odd not odd, how do I explain this? I thought it was just interesting that this ability, or this plague that Queen was spreading around, had this twofold sort of effect, where one, it's freezing people, but two, at the same time, it's turning them into sort of zombie Oni type monsters that attack their own allies. So I was just a little surprised that I was like, why is it one and not the other? Or like, why is it not one or the other, you know? And then I think this chapter, I kind of made the connection that it could just be a callback to Ors. You know, we are in Onigashima. Ors was known as, you know, the demon from the frozen land. He was a gigantic Oni from a frozen land. He was Ors the continent puller and everything like that. He was basically known as this gigantic ice demon. So we don't know that much about the Oni race, or if they all come from this frozen area. But at the very least, you know, we're in Onigashima. We're in Onigashima, which is a giant Oni island. This could just be like Oda's soft callback to Ors or something along those lines, that like everybody's being turned into ice Onis, reminiscent of like little baby Orses for whatever reason. I don't know, I just think it's interesting. That kind of makes a little more sense to me why this ice aspect of it and this Oni aspect of it kind of makes sense together. So I think it's interesting. At the same time, so you might say that basically, well, things seem to be going pretty badly for the protagonist at the moment with all of this ice Oni stuff happening. I don't feel like, you know, I'm obviously somebody who is a strong proponent of the idea that this whole raid on Onigashima is going to fail, but I'll be honest, I don't view this as anything indicative of things going south for the Alliance, because the tone surrounding all of it seemed to be like, yeah, they're going to bounce back from this. You know what I mean? It felt like, you know, from what Hyogoro said, from the fact that there is a clear solution, which is the antidote that Queen gave Dapu, which I'll talk about in a second, and, you know, the hour time limit that's been set, it seems pretty clear to me that it's more likely than not that they are going to be able to get their hands on that antidote and basically save everybody who's there, who's on their side, right? And plus they're good guys, so maybe they'll save Kaido's crew too. I don't know. But point being, tonally, it did not feel like this was the end of the line for the Alliance or anything like that, or this was some insurmountable obstacle that they've just been hit with. Obviously, this was a rough spot for them to have to now deal with this ice Oni situation, but it does seem pretty clear to me that, like, they are going to be able to deal with it because the solution is right there. You know, they've got an hour time limit to basically catch up to Apu and get this antibody. Now, I hope that we get a good moment for Chopper out of all of this, and I do like the fact that Chopper is kind of taking command of the situation. Not necessarily command, but he's asserting himself, at least in this situation, and basically saying, we need to get this antibody, I'll be able to administer it to the people as needed, but he's kind of taking it as his responsibility, and I like that. And I like the fact that he's sending Zoro on Apu's tail. That's going to make for another interesting interaction. And I really, really like the fact that Queen is playing this little game, because Queen has been one of my more favorite new characters coming out of Wano as a whole, and a chapter like this just reinforces that, because Queen is, I think, by far the most entertaining henchman that we've had for a villain so far. I'm not going to say that Queen's better than someone like Katakuri, or even necessarily someone like King, because King is just, you know, interesting in his own way. But Queen is definitely entertaining. Queen keeps things fun. He's a more zany character with more of a knack for shenanigans like this, right? So I enjoyed seeing Queen basically cause chaos a little bit just for the sake of causing chaos, kind of throwing Apu under the bus just for the sake of it, even though he's calling him Brother Apu even as he's tossing him the antidote. It's just a more entertaining form of henchman than we've gotten so far in the series for the most part. Now, on the flip side, I'm going to talk about this real quick, which is, do I still think that the Onigashima raid will end in failure? Look, in my heart of hearts, I will always believe that everything here is heading for failure. But at the same time, in my heart of hearts, sometimes I'm not so sure. So chapters like this make me a little unsure, because, yeah, I could see things lining up in that, you know, Luffy is on his way up to defeat Kaido after he goes through several levels. It seems like Zoro has a clear mission. It seems like Chopper has a clear mission. Usopp and Nami have already broken off to do their thing, potentially against Ulti in page 1. Even Yamato, who I haven't spoken about yet, but I will in a minute. Yamato seems to potentially be matched up with Sasaki. Jack's on his way down. Maybe Jack will fight Jinbei and Sanji instead of Luffy. There's a lot of things that could happen that could basically spell this out to be the end of the arc. Maybe the tragedy really is just the tragedy of Act 3 that a lot of us expect. Maybe that really is just one or two, or maybe several even, of the Scabbards dying to Kaido before Luffy gets up there and finishes the job. So a lot of that would personally be... it depends how Oda would do it, because if this really is the climax of Onigashima, then there's obviously going to be a lot more storytelling that goes on here that could potentially make me, a lot more on board with a lot of the choices that Oda's made so far. And there could be a lot more character moments that come out of this that I'm not expecting at the moment. At the same time, the main thing is basically the tone, so I'm always paying attention to how does the tone of the chapter feel, and does it feel like things are shifting towards basically a sharp change for the protagonist's chances, right? I felt at the end of last chapter that now Oda's flipping the switch and basically saying, okay, they're not going to succeed so easily. But then I look at this chapter where we have, this honestly comical scene of Apu running around while everyone's trying to chase him. And it doesn't feel like, everything's going to end right here. Or sorry, that everything's going to go south for the protagonist right here. It actually does feel somewhat lighthearted. Same with Luffy going up with Sanji and Jinbei and running into the gifters and stuff. So we're still getting comedy scenes, which tells me that, no, it doesn't feel like they're about to lose right now. Maybe they will shortly, but it's not happening necessarily like next chapter, you know what I mean? So a lot of questions there. I will put out a video sometime next week explaining my thoughts of what's coming in the chapters to come. It won't be the next video, it'll be the week after that, so maybe late next week, basically. But it is interesting to think about. I honestly see two forks in the road. You can go either way. I'm obviously going to stick with the idea that the raid is going to end in failure, because I'm not just going to backtrack on my prediction at this point. I've already stuck with that. But I'm definitely going to acknowledge that I might be wrong with this. And if I'm wrong, I'll hold the L and everything like that. But let's just wait and see. Anyway, next scene is, well, the final scene of the chapter is Yamato and Momonosuke. I understand for many people this was the highlight scene of the chapter, especially if you're a fan of Yamato. For me, basically, I need to see more between the Yamato and Momonosuke dynamic for me to actually care that much between what goes on between these two characters. Yamato I obviously already like as a character, and I think I've mentioned that in the chapters that Yamato was introduced. But still, to me, the dynamic between Yamato and Momonosuke, it definitely has potential to be very interesting. But at the moment, there's just nothing for me there yet. So hopefully next chapter, when we get to see them interact a little more beyond Yamato explaining who she is and what she saw, then I'll start to feel a little more invested in between how they're going to grow off of each other. So that's all for this review. If you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll talk to you all next week.